What if the frozen wilderness became a sanctuary where a nun's broken vow and a soldier's hidden scars could mend one another? Thank you for being so kind. Now please subscribe and give me a like so I know you're ready to listen to this story. I'm going to tell you a surprising secret about the nun's fate. To discover the answer, let us begin in Snow Creek Valley, where winter's silence hides both faith and longing. Snow Creek Valley had a way of silencing a soul. On winter nights when the wind howled across the white-drowned fields and rattled the shutters of the convent, Sister Agnes Winter sometimes wondered if the Lord's voice was hidden in that sound, mournful, distant, and unrelenting. She had come to love the quiet discipline of the valley, the repetition of prayer, the tending of herbs, the healing of wounds. And yet there were moments when she stood in the garden, frost biting at her skin, looking out toward the vast wild expanse that she felt the echo of something else. Loneliness, patient and persistent as the snow itself. It was on such a night that a pounding came at the convent's gate. The storm had risen quickly, a blizzard rolling down from the mountains with merciless force. The other sisters had withdrawn to the chapel for evening prayers, but Agnes lingered in the infirmary sorting dried chamomile blossoms and willow bark for winter fevers. At first she thought the knocking was the wind itself, some loose shutter slamming against stone. But then came the sound again, louder, desperate, undeniably human. She wrapped her shawl tight and hurried to the gate. When she pulled it open, a figure loomed in the swirl of snow. A man tall and broad-shouldered, his coat stiff with frost, his hat rimmed white. In his arms he carried a child bundled in quilts, her face pale as wax. "Please," the man's voice was hoarse, cracked from cold and fear. "She's burning up. I had nowhere else to go." Agnes felt her heart jolt, the healer in her rising even before the nun. "Bring her inside quickly." Within minutes, the child was laid upon a narrow cot in the infirmary, the lamplight casting a fragile glow over her small form. The girl's chest rose in shallow, wheezing breaths, each one rattling with effort. Beads of sweat clung to her brow despite the bitter cold that still clung to her father's coat. "What is her name?" Agnes asked, already steeping herbs in hot water, preparing a poultice for the girl's chest. "Eliana," he whispered, removing his hat with clumsy, trembling hands. "Eliana Stone, she's all I have." Agnes looked at him, then truly looked. He was perhaps 35, maybe a few years older, with a face carved by work and grief. Snow clung to his beard, melted into rivulets down weather-worn cheeks. His eyes, dark, restless, watched her every move, full of a desperate hope he dared not speak. "She has fever from the lungs," Agnes said softly, laying her hand against the child's thin chest. "I will do what I can." Through the long hours of that storm-struck night, she worked without rest. She crushed garlic and thyme, pressing their warmth against Eliana's skin. She brewed willow bark tea, coaxing sips between the child's parched lips. She prayed aloud as she worked not only for the child's life but for strength in her own hands. And the father, Jedediah Stone, knelt nearby, silent, his great hands clenched as if to hold the world together. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Eliana's breathing steadied, though each breath still carried the fragile whistle of weakness. When her lashes fluttered open, hazel eyes met the nun's with faint curiosity before closing again in exhausted sleep. Agnes felt her own shoulders sag in relief. She turned to Jed. "She will need care, but she will live through this night." For a moment, the man simply bowed his head, and Agnes thought he might weep. Instead, he took her hand, a rough, calloused hand around hers, and whispered, "Thank you, I can never repay this." She did not know then that this man and this child would ask of her a vow more difficult than any she had ever made within convent walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the infirmary, something fragile had begun a bond born not of choice, but of desperate need. And in that need lay the seed of a test that would shake Agnes Winter's understanding of faith itself. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the valley in drifts that buried fence posts and bent the pines. Life in Snow Creek demanded bargains between man and winter, between hunger and survival. Sister Agnes Winter thought she understood those bargains well until Jedediah Stone returned to the convent door. He did not come with flowers, nor with gratitude wrapped in the polite words of townsfolk. Instead, he came with his hat in his hands and a look that carried the weight of a man who had run out of choices. "My girl breathes easier because of you," Jed said, voice low, eyes avoiding hers. "But winter doesn't ease its grip. I have to work the traps, hunt meat, keep the fire alive. I can't do it and keep her safe, too. She needs more than I can give." Agnes felt the unease coil in her chest. "Mr. Stone, Jedediah," she said carefully, "what are you asking of me?" His gaze lifted, then steady raw. "Not a wife, not a vow to me, only a promise to Eliana. Come to my home until the thaw. Watch over her, teach her, tend her when the fevers rise. I'll see to wood and food, you'll see to her life. It is not marriage, it is survival." The words hung in the infirmary like the smoke of the oil lamp. Agnes's breath caught. To leave the convent to dwell under the same roof as this man, it was against everything she had pledged. And yet when she looked at the child sleeping soundly, cheeks now flushed with the faintest color of health, she knew the request was no simple matter of propriety. That evening she sought counsel with Mother Therese. The old woman listened with eyes half closed, her hands folded in the habit of prayer. "Sister," she said at last, her voice as calm as falling snow, "sometimes the Lord asks us to kneel in pews. Other times he asks us to kneel in the dirt beside those in need. The question is not whether this breaks your vow, but whether it fulfills the deeper one to serve." So it was that 2 days later Agnes crossed the frozen creek with Jed Stone and entered his cabin. The house was plain rough-hewn logs, darkened by years of smoke, but it carried the smell of cedar and wood fire, a smell not of sanctity but of survival. Eliana's smile, faint but true, greeted her at the threshold. Agnes bent to kiss the girl's brow, and in that moment something inside her shifted. She was not leaving faith behind. She was carrying it into another wilderness. What none of them yet knew was how winter has a way of binding strangers together, turning bargains into bonds that neither snow nor silence can easily undo. If you'd like to walk with Agnes and Jed through the long winter nights, press 1 in the comments. And if you think she should have stayed in the convent instead, press 0. Your thoughts will help guide how we journey deeper into this Wild West tale of faith, survival, and love. Winter does not forgive the unprepared, and Agnes soon learned that Jed Stone's cabin was less a home and more a fortress against the cold. Every wall creaked, every joint leaked, and every hour demanded work if they were to keep the frost from swallowing them whole. At first, Agnes moved through the house like a guest, too careful to touch. She prayed in whispers, kept her eyes lowered, and busied herself only with Eliana's care. But as the nights deepened and the snow piled higher, silence itself pressed in on them. It forced the 3 souls under that roof into an intimacy none had asked for, but all had come to need. It was on a night of bitter wind that the first true bond revealed itself. Eliana had been restless, her cough clawing at her tiny chest. Agnes sat beside her bed, spooning warm broth sweetened with honey to soothe the child's throat. Jed, pacing like a caged wolf, finally dropped into the chair opposite and let his head fall into his calloused hands. "I buried her mother in a storm like this," he muttered, voice hoarse. "The ground so hard I thought the Lord himself had frozen it shut against me. I prayed, sister. I prayed till my throat bled, and still she died. After that I saw no use for prayer." Agnes lifted her eyes from the child to the man, and in the flickering lamplight his grief looked as raw as any wound she had ever tended. She wanted to speak of faith, of God's plan, but the words tangled with doubt. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "You did not bury her alone," she said softly. "The Lord was there, though you could not feel him. Sometimes his presence is in the hands that carry us forward, not in the answers we long for." Jed's shoulders tightened, but he did not pull away. Later, when Eliana drifted into easier sleep, Agnes found a forgotten relic tucked high on a shelf, a dust-covered fiddle, one string snapped but still whole enough to sing. She tuned what she could, and with trembling hands played a hymn her mother had once hummed when the world felt too heavy. The sound filled the cabin, weaving through the cracks and smoke, and Jed's eyes shone wet, though no words passed his lips. Days stretched into weeks. Together they mended walls, rationed supplies, and braced against storms that seemed to come one after another. Jed taught Agnes how to read the tracks of fox and hare in the snow, and she in turn taught him patience at the hearth, where herbs steeped into healing teas. It was no longer sister and mister, but Agnes and Jed called gently in the quiet of survival. Something unnamed grew between them, stronger than duty, softer than prayer, and as dangerous as fire in a house of dry wood. Still, the outside world did not sleep. Rumors crept from town, whispers that a nun had left her convent to live beneath a widower's roof, and faraway letters began their slow journey across frozen trails, carrying questions from bishops and deacons who believed faith could only live behind cloistered walls. Agnes, unaware, looked at the girl she now tucked into bed each night and wondered whether love itself could be a kind of vow. If this story has warmed you on a cold evening, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. And if you're enjoying how Agnes and Jed's winter unfolds, give this tale a gentle, like it helps keep these Wild West stories alive by the firelight. The fiddle's hymn still lingered in Jed's ears long after Agnes had set the instrument aside. For the first time in years, music had filled the cabin, not the rowdy clatter of a saloon, but something fragile, sacred. Yet as the days marched on, that fragile peace was tested by whispers neither could ignore. Snow had begun to thaw in hesitant patches, revealing tracks that led to town. Jed ventured in for flour and salt, returning with more than he carried out. "They're talking," he muttered, setting his sack down with a thud. "Said a nun has forsaken her vows to warm herself by a widower's fire." His eyes, hard as winter ice, searched Agnes's face. "You know how folks are. Their tongues cut sharper than any knife." Agnes lowered her gaze, her hands folding in her lap. She had felt the weight of unseen eyes each time she stepped outside to fetch wood or fetch water. The habit she once wore had marked her as untouchable, untarnished. But here in a cabin of worn timbers and flickering lamplight, she was a woman teaching a child her prayers, breaking bread beside a grieving man, and wondering if her heart's quickening pulse was sin or salvation. That night, Eliana slept soundly, her small breath soft against the quilt. Agnes sat by the fire, mending a torn sleeve when Jed finally spoke. "You don't belong to me," he said quietly. "You belong to God, and if staying here ruins that, if it stains your name—" He stopped, his rough hands tightening against his knees. "Then I'll ride you back to the convent myself come spring." The words cut deeper than he meant them to. Agnes set her needle aside and looked across the fire. His face, carved by wind and grief, carried a tenderness he himself didn't seem to notice. "Jed," she whispered, "my vows were to serve, to heal, to protect, to bring light where darkness falls. Perhaps God never meant for me to hide behind stone walls. Perhaps he meant me to find this place, this child, this burden we share." The flames cracked, throwing sparks like stars against the dark. Jed's jaw clenched, torn between relief and fear. He had lived too long believing love was a trick of fate, a gift snatched away before it could bloom. To feel it stir again here in this woman who still called herself a bride of Christ was both miracle and torment. As winter's grip loosened, trials of a different kind appeared. Letters came carried by riders with church seals pressed in wax. Questions veiled as concerns. Would Sister Agnes return? Did she intend to honor the path she had chosen? Jed never asked what she wrote in reply, but each letter left her pale and sleepless. Yet the cabin changed. Where once there had been silence, there was laughter. Eliana's giggles at bedtime tales, Jed's quiet chuckle when Agnes scolded him for stomping snow across her freshly swept floor. A family imperfect but real began to take root in the rocky soil of survival. Still, every joy was shadowed by choice. Spring was coming. Roads would open. The convent would expect her. Jed could not say the words, but his every glance begged her to stay. Agnes could not promise, for promises were chains. And in her prayers she asked the Lord not for guidance, but for courage to follow where love and faith entwined, even if the path led away from everything she had once believed unshakable. If you've walked this far with Agnes and Jed, let me know you're still with them. Press 2 if you feel she should return to her vows. Press 3 if you believe her new life here might be the truest calling of all. Spring arrived like a hesitant guest, knocking softly at the door of winter before daring to enter. Patches of green pushed through the snow streams broke their icy silence, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. But with the thaw came decision, and Agnes felt it heavy upon her heart. Every morning she rose before dawn, kneeling at the edge of the cot where Eliana slept. Her prayers had changed, not words of escape or longing, but words asking for courage, for clarity. The letters from the convent lay folded inside her Bible, their ink fading, their instructions growing colder with each line. Return, restore, repent. Jed never spoke of them, yet his silence said everything. He chopped wood until his hands blistered. He worked the soil, though frost still lurked beneath it. A man bracing himself for loss the way he once braced against storms, quiet, stubborn, unflinching. One evening, when the sky was a wash of rose and gold, Agnes stepped outside with Eliana in her arms. Jed stood by the fence line, watching the horizon as though it might carry answers. She walked to him slowly, her skirts brushing new grass. "Jed," she said softly, "do you believe God ever changes his mind?" He turned, brow furrowed. "I reckon God knows his mind better than we do." Agnes drew a breath, steadying her voice. "Then perhaps he knew, even when I first took my vows, that they would lead me here. To you. To her." She kissed the child's hair. "Service doesn't end in stone walls. Love is a service, too. And maybe this," her voice trembled, "maybe this is the holiest work I'll ever do." Jed's hands, rough and scarred, gripped the fence rail until his knuckles whitened. "You're certain?" "No," she admitted. But faith was never about certainty, it was about trust. The words hung in the cooling air, fragile as new blossoms. And then Jed did something he hadn't done since the day they first met. He reached for her hand, not as a rescuer, not as a master, but as a man offering what little he had left to give. She took it, her fingers trembling, her eyes shining with unshed tears. That night, as Eliana slept, Agnes placed the unopened letters in the fire. Flames curled around them, devouring the words that once chained her. She whispered a final prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength to honor this new path. Jed sat beside her, the firelight softening his stern features, and for the first time he looked at peace. The seasons turned quickly. The soil warmed, crops began to sprout, and the cabin filled with signs of a life not borrowed but built. Eliana learned to run barefoot through the fields, her laughter carrying across the valley. Agnes planted herbs by the window, teaching Jed the healing secrets she once guarded as sacred knowledge. And Jed, though still quiet, learned to smile again, real smiles, the kind that reached the corners of his eyes. One Sunday, Agnes gathered them at the table. No chapel, no bells, no polished altar. Just a worn Bible, a loaf of bread, and two hands joined over the hands of a child. She spoke words of blessing, her voice steady, her eyes clear. It was not the life she once vowed to live, but it was no less holy. When neighbors passed by, they no longer whispered of scandal. They spoke of a widow's cabin turned to laughter, of a child who found a home, of a man who found his heart again. And so it was that winter's vow gave way to spring's promise, not a promise of perfection nor of certainty, but of a family bound not by duty alone, but by chosen love. In the silence of Snow Creek's winter, we discover the true meaning of faith, not bound only by vows, but revealed through love, sacrifice, and compassion. Sister Agnes and Jed remind us that God's presence is found not only in chapels, but also in acts of mercy and courage. The message is clear: when we serve others with open hearts, we honor Him. Love itself becomes a prayer, and through it, broken souls can be made whole again. If this story touched your heart, let me know by subscribing and leaving a comment. Your voice keeps these tales of hope alive.